So again, welcome to today's webinar, The End of Poverty. We're thrilled to have you here. My name's Adam Vasey. I'm Director of Policy, Learning and Evaluation with Tamarack's Vibrant Communities Canada. Prior to joining Tamarack, I spent 8 years as Director of Pathway to Potential in Windsor, Essex, the poverty reduction initiative there. And at that time, I was an active member of the Cities Reducing Poverty Network. So I'm really excited to be here today to introduce the discussion on the end of poverty with Paul Bourne, who is the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute and the founder and director of Vibrant Communities. Paul is the author of 4 books, including 2 Canadian bestsellers, as well as a global faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute and a senior fellow of Ashoka, the world's largest network of social innovators. So my first question, Paul, for you, why don't we just get started right away here, is back in June when we had our Cities Innovating to Reduce Poverty Summit in Vancouver, you were slated to do a presentation on the end of poverty, and a lot of people were really excited to hear you talk about that subject, but unfortunately time didn't allow for you to give a full presentation. So why don't we start by you telling me, why did you want to give that talk?
You know, Adam, thanks for being on this call, and thanks for all of your work, your life's work in helping to end poverty and particularly in the Windsor Essex area. You've been a massive contribution to the Cities Reducing Poverty Network. You know, I'm an optimist at heart, and this is, I know, more than optimism. You know. Though I want to context this because my wife will often say, Paul, you know, those people who see the cup as half empty and those who see the cup as half full, well, you see the cup as overflowing most days, and that just exhausts me. So I smile at that because I do believe that we are at a new time in poverty reduction. I've worked at this work all of my life, my entire adult life. I grew up in a family that were refugees after the Second World War, and we were living in poverty probably until I was in my teens. But we were farmers, so it was a little bit different. Something has really changed in the new millennium. That has led to some really interesting things. And of course, on Tuesday, we were all introduced to the new National Poverty Reduction Strategy. I was struck by this moment. I had been waiting for it for a very long time. I remember being actively involved with the Senate, helping them develop their poverty reduction strategy. Have worked with the federal government for a very long time, and then we had a government in power that seemed to ignore the need for a national strategy. And over the last few years, as we've been helping Minister Duclos put together this strategy, we've learned not only about what the national government can do, what the federal government can do, but we've learned about what they already do. And when you just start to think about the different programs that are at play, including the National Child Benefit, the workers' benefit, when you think about the massive investment in housing, I mean, that's been the first time in how long, you know? And then when you come across with a national poverty reduction strategy that says that it's an all society approach, you know, we're all to be involved, that we have a government that has the guts to say, we're gonna measure poverty. So they've given us for the first time a poverty reduction measure. That they've set targets, aggressive ones and immediate ones, 20% by 2020, 50% by 2030. I know there's a cynic in me that wants to look at this and not be optimistic, But I can't help it. I've been at this all my life, and it's the first time, it's an historic moment. We have a strategy, and it's a good one. Is it perfect? No. Is it more than I expected? It is. Um, and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for it. But you know, it goes beyond that, because even though we had a federal government for many years that wasn't interested in poverty reduction, our provinces were quite different. Ontario created a national poverty reduction strategy. New Brunswick. Alberta has one. They've been implementing it. They just don't call it that, right? But they've done an amazing report on all the work that this government has done to reduce poverty. And now British Columbia is implementing one. Prince Edward Island is putting one together. I mean, it's like, it feels like every province and the federal government. And then, of course, when you start looking at cities reducing poverty, we now have 178 cities represented by 62 regions who are all implementing poverty reduction strategies. So just on that level alone, the sheer number of strategies that are out there, it means more than people sitting around a table and thinking. Right? It actually translates into real programs at the neighborhood level, at the community level, at the city level. It means that the provinces are rethinking how they're approaching things, and they're coming up with their own innovations and their own solutions. And now the the federal government. It's enough in itself to get me to think that poverty has the potential to be ended in our lifetime. But that's only the planning phase. Now let's look at what I think the most significant of all. And I want to give credit to the living wage movement in Canada. There have been such amazing people, Tom in Halifax, Catherine in Vancouver, and the list just goes on of people who've dedicated the last number of years to really pushing the living wage movement. But what did it translate into? Well, it translated into a provincial government, maybe in a desperate moment, but hey, they did it. It was gutsy. Ontario, right away to a $14 minimum wage. Then we've got Alberta moving toward a $15 minimum wage. British Columbia is going to get there very soon. It feels like the minimum wage question is a big one. And I know that we have had changes in government in Ontario, and they may not be as aggressive around the minimum wage, but we've made such progress, and it's my feeling that this is going to leap forward. And I'll talk about this later, but for me, the fundamental marker of the end of poverty is when there is a national commitment to, when you work, you will not be poor. And I know $15 isn't quite there yet, but it's a leap forward, and there's a leap in consciousness that I think is really, really important for us to think about. And so, though there's all these strategies at the federal and the provincial level, there's this massive change in thinking about the relevance of the minimum wage. And I know that when they instituted it in Ontario, even when there was a lot of fight against it, when they did a provincial poll, 70% of Canadians felt it was the right thing to do. I agree with that. Now, the third thing that is exciting, and of course I would come at it from this angle because I direct Cities Reducing Poverty. There is a lot of innovation going on around poverty reduction. Now, part of it is the innovation there's been an innovation backdrop. So there's a large social innovation movement that has occurred in Canada, and led really by the folks at the McConnell Institute, the McConnell Foundation, and the folks at Mars and Tanya Cernum's work in Ontario. But it's gone further. When we start looking at the number of cities that want to create a poverty reduction strategy, one of their primary goals is to rethink how they are addressing poverty at the local level. And this is translating then into new ideas and programs, new approaches to working at Aboriginal poverty, urban Aboriginal poverty reduction, new approaches to tackling homelessness, new approaches to income security and finances, like Prosper Canada has been implementing, new approaches to food and food security, and you know, it's I could go on, and I'm hoping that there'll be lots of time during this conversation for us to really bring forth these movements. But you know, I've been at this now as long in the new millennium as I was in the old millennium, you know, 2000. And I just feel like the momentum is building and building. And I know we're going to talk a little later on about the new Angus Reid poll, and Adam, you just put out a blog on this. And I'm really hoping we can send this out to all the listeners. But Angus Reid did a really interesting poll about what Canadians felt governments should do. First, they kind of did a record of understanding poverty, but then also what governments should do. And overwhelmingly, Canadians want more done. They want more done to end poverty. And so public opinion is shifting. And you know, yeah, we can start to think about all the bad things in the world and all the bad people and all the people with all the rhetoric. And they're all around us, particularly in the United States. And that news comes over and it shapes how we think about what's going on. And our hearts are heavy and they're full with the pain that's happening in the world. But I do think we need to take stock of the good things that are happening, the real things that are happening, that are having substantive, that are making a substantive difference in the world. I just can't wait for the next 20 years. I think we're gonna, I honestly do think that we are going to end poverty in my lifetime. So Adam, take that for what it is.
Well, thanks, Paul. And I remember actually at a Vibrant Communities gathering several years back, hearing you say something to the effect of, you really believe that we would see an end to poverty in your lifetime. And I can remember feeling at the time a lot more skeptical than I am now. I'm probably not as optimistic as you. Not sure anybody on this call or anywhere is. And I appreciate that, because I think I know from being in the work on the ground in Windsor, Essex, and hearing about strategies and seeing them come out, there can be that sense that, well, how robust is this, or how much of a difference is this really going to make? But I'm actually quite optimistic as well when I look at particularly what has been happening in the new millennium and the sheer growth in the number of communities that are taking the lead on poverty reduction through the Vibrant Communities Network, but also the growth in provincial and territorial strategies, and now, of course, having a federal strategy, when there were years when I really questioned whether we would ever see that happen. So I'm optimistic right now, but I'm really curious to see and hear from the audience on the call right now what people are thinking. So we actually have a poll question about your level of optimism about poverty reduction in Canada right now. So feel free to make your
Adam,
choice.
are we supposed to click on these?
Yes.
Yes, you are. So on your screen, you should be seeing a poll. What are you most optimistic about regarding poverty reduction? We have the federal poverty reduction strategy, minimum wage reform, local innovation, like basic income, public opinion is shifting, or something else. So just take a couple of minutes, click on one of those.
Probably only takes a couple of seconds, Natasha, and it says I'm not allowed to vote. Hey, I tried.
Oh, no. It's you know what? There's a pretty even split. It's changing all the time, but it looks like about a third of people are really excited for the federal poverty reduction strategy. or maybe, you know what, it's split between a quarter. A quarter are really excited about the federal poverty reduction strategy, a quarter on minimum wage reform, a quarter local innovation, and a quarter public opinion is shifting, and then almost nothing in the other category.
Well, yeah, but let's keep going. Is that everybody voting? So
That
is it like, you figure it's about 25% at each? So we've got a kind of split, kind of the optimism is at all of those levels.
Absolutely.
Adam, what's your take on that? What
Well,
are we,
yeah, I mean,
what are we seeing here?
that's fascinating. I think it just speaks to the diversity of approaches in poverty reduction and the passion that people have. And, you know, for some people maybe who have been actively involved in minimum wage reform, I mean, in those efforts, that was relatively quick. Those are relatively quick wins, you know, in a short period of time, with really strong movements on the ground, which I think were bolstered by the living wage movement, as you talked about. So I think there's that. There's a lot of excitement, we know, around questions of basic income and also other local innovative approaches that are happening at the community level. Others are probably, I think when it comes to the federal strategy, I mean, there is a lot. I've heard the criticism that, well, you know, there wasn't a lot of new, big, flashy, you know, announcements or new spending. But when you look at, you know, there was a really strong commitment from the federal government around what they feel works very well in addressing poverty, and they set bold targets, and they are creating an official poverty line in Canada, and they're talking about a rights-based approach. So, like, these are all things that advocates have been asking for ages, you know, and so I can see how a lot of these would inspire hope amongst people. And then the public opinion piece, I think, is really important, because I remember looking at polls back to the late 90s, public opinion polls, and there was very little urgency and broad public support for governments to tackle poverty, and I think we're really seeing that shift. So, you know, I think it just speaks to the diversity of the work that's happening across this country.
Absolutely. And I wonder, Adam, if we would have done instead of other, if we would have had one called all of the above, I wonder how many people would have clicked that one. It's interesting because, you know, when you think of those four alone, they're major movements and they're major happenings in Canada. And I'm with you on your optimism. Adam, you know, I have been so impressed by this latest release, and I know this paper is going to go into its final draft, the State of Cities Reducing Poverty, that you wrote for the Poverty Reduction Summit Western Canada in Vancouver. And you've been asking people for opinions on it, and you'll be releasing the final report in September in Mississauga at the Poverty Reduction Strategy Summit, Eastern Canada. For those of you who haven't registered yet, you can easily go and do that on the Tamarack website. But one of the things that I loved about your paper was that you looked at the new millennium, and you said, what are some of the movements? Because Cities Reducing Poverty is a movement that grew in the new millennium. Started in 2002. Some called it a new era of poverty reduction, and Cities Reducing Poverty was one of the leaders in sort of creating a new way. I remember when we started it, most cities told us that poverty was not their issue; it was a provincial or federal government issue. But now it's of course much more than that, and it's almost all cities have one or are working on one. But in there, you laid out a whole series of movements that have arisen, and then all of these movements have kind of played on one another to create this kind of watershed moment. Take us through some of those movements and the ones that are most exciting to you.
Sure. Well, I think the big one is, and we've already talked about this a little bit, is strategies, is this idea that we have governments at all levels that are making the commitment to develop strategies, and they're building off each other, they're learning from each other, and they're watching what's happening in other jurisdictions, and that has just had such a cascading effect, I feel, when I look at how rapidly that's grown, that momentum has grown over the past 15 years or so. I think that's remarkable, and I know there can be that, as we've talked about, some cynicism around strategies, but I think that's so important as a foundation, because if you don't have that strategy, you don't have that document to point to and that compass for your work, it makes it very difficult to get anything done in a meaningful way. So I think that if I could lump, the strategies that are taking place, whether it's within the Vibrant Communities Network at the municipal level, or even, community-led strategies that aren't being led by government, that's really exciting. And I think we've seen how all of that momentum has helped to culminate in now this week, the National Poverty Reduction Strategy. So that to me has been a real innovation and an important movement in the new millennium that can't be underestimated. The other one that I'm going to just kind of lump a few things together is ideas around and movements around income security. So whether that's the living wage movement and the minimum wage reform movement and the momentum around basic income, I feel that has been so influential. Those ideas are all interrelated, and they're all increasingly, I think, based on people who are doing the work on the ground and making clear links between income and health, income and our collective prosperity. So income and creating inclusive communities, and I've really seen that as sort of a narrative that has emerged, regardless of which movement somebody's a part of, whether it's living wage and minimum wage. To me, those are really feeding off each other and drawing on a lot of the same evidence and a lot of the same business case, which is really compelling. And I also think on that point that social movements in Canada have played an incredibly important role in informing those other movements around policy. And so I think of, what role did Occupy play, and what role are, movements like Idle No More and Black Lives Matter and others playing in starting to connect the dots and starting to talk about equity and addressing some of the the unacceptable levels of inequity in our society, whether it's wealth or income or identity based. So that to me is really exciting. I also think the national advocacy movements in Canada over, fairly consistently over the last, certainly in the new millennium and even predating that, have been really consistent and clear on the need to talk about poverty elimination and the need to talk about, contextualize that in rights-based approaches. And I think that's been very important, contributing to public and political will and building that and helping to devise frameworks for what a national strategy would look like. I'm thinking about the Dignity for All campaign, for example. And so I think that stands out. And then I could go on, but in the interest of time, I won't, because there's so many to choose from. But you mentioned a couple that I think are like housing first and the work around financial empowerment. I think those have also been really impactful as far as community-based approaches to poverty reduction that are yielding results. And then, of course, there's collective impact, and I think we can't really, downplay the importance of that. Vibrant Communities was, based on a collective impact initiative, and I think that's helped inform so much of the work. So those would be my just sort of off the top of my head what jumps out, but there's so many to choose from. It's hard to decide.
That's fabulous, Adam. Let's go to another poll and let's just see what the listeners are feeling. We're going to give you 4 choices here around the movements that are most important in poverty reduction in the new millennium. And we've got the provincial and territorial poverty reduction strategies, cities reducing poverty movement, innovations in income support, and rights-based approach to poverty. We've got those up now. Take some time to vote. And when you start seeing the results come in, Natasha, maybe you can let us know what we're seeing.
So immediately, the rights-based approach is jumping out, as is innovations in income support. So kind of like the basic income. The cities reducing poverty movement is right up there as well. And then people are less excited about provincial and territorial poverty reduction strategies. And interestingly enough, we don't have anybody voting for other. So it looks like we've hit the target there.
But if somebody has something they want to say about other, feel free to use your chat box.
Yeah, we'd love to hear any of your thoughts, particularly around the movements that you feel have really had an impact, because there's a lot of other ones around the food security movement. There's been incredible innovations around housing that have been occurring in the country. I know that there's been some really, really interesting work just purely around financial models and the social economy and community economic development. And I mean, the list just goes on. It's exciting. So let us know the ones that have excited and interested you, and use your chat box to send some of those around to us at this point.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for participating in those polls. And so, Paula, we've already heard from you that you really are optimistic about the direction of poverty reduction in Canada and the possibility of ending poverty. And I'd like to hear from you a little bit whether you think these movements are really making a difference in moving us in that direction toward an end to poverty, and say a little bit more about that and how you make those links.
Yeah, so Adam, this is where it gets a bit muddled for me. I want to see population level outcomes. And what I'm seeing is a lot of good programs having a lot of good results. I get really excited when I see places like the city of Hamilton that has a population level reduction in poverty, especially for children. I've seen that in St. John. We've seen places like Medicine Hat eliminating homelessness. These are real, okay? But when we start looking at the overall national statistics about poverty, we struggle to make sense of them. And I feel, first of all, that in order for us to really understand where we're making progress, we need much better data. We need data by population factors, in low-income neighborhoods. We need data for single parents. We need data for homeless people. We need data for new Canadians. Like, we need to start to break down the data in a way that helps us to truly understand the many different reasons people are living in poverty. And we need to see where we're making progress on those. I've often said that there is no such thing as people living in poverty. There are just individual people living in poverty. So it's not like we say poverty and we mean everyone that's poor. And then somehow we try to create this sense that everyone's poor for the same reason. And it's just not true, that there are many reasons that people are poor. And we need to get much better at understanding that and then understanding where we're making progress. And then where we're making progress on some level of scale. So I'm really optimistic, but I feel we need to do some more work. The areas that I think are of highest priority are, because it's an all society response, we do need to look at wages, and we do need to look at good work. So I want us to really begin to focus a lot of our efforts and a lot of thinking around this notion: if you work, you should not be poor. And we need to create a much stronger system that eliminates the working poor as a category of poverty. My sense is that most of the working poor are in the they're in the service industry, and it doesn't seem to me to make any sense that we want to keep wages low in the service industry, because it's not a competitive issue. If we raise all the wages in the service industry, now everyone just has to raise their rates, and it's really an inflation issue more than it is a competitiveness issue. And I think we can do that. The second area that's really important, I feel, is that children should never be the cause of poverty. And we're doing a lot with programs like the Child Benefit Program, the Worker Benefit Program, but I do think we need a national daycare strategy if we're going to make a difference. I think most parents that are poor want to work, want to better their lives for their children, and we need to make that really easy. And I think there just needs to be even a whole different employment program for parents with children to help them transition into work. Most of them are single mothers in particular that are living in poverty and caring for their children. And there are very proven programs to help us deal with that. And lastly, my sense is if we can really eliminate the need, like if there is no more working poor, if we've taken care of the families with children and realize that there's kind of a transition phase that's going on there, then I think we can afford the guaranteed basic income. I think it's a very hopeful initiative. It seems to me that it's really hard to afford if we have so many people who are working that are poor. It's so hard to afford when parents can't go back to work because daycare costs are sometimes equal to what they would be earning. I think if we could take care of those two well, we could afford the guaranteed basic income for people who can't work and for people who need those types of greater supports. So I'm very optimistic about the movements, but I do think we need to focus on the population level questions, looking at where people are really poor and tackling those issues one at a time. And then in doing so, we start to bring down the numbers of poor, and we work in the areas where we have the most success. Optimist, absolutely. I wish I had better data to prove my optimism.
Terrific. Well, and I think, you've touched on a lot of things to be hopeful about and really optimistic about. And you've also, I think, given us some ideas around what that path looks like, that policy path looks like to ending poverty and getting really clear and specific and focused. So at this point, why don't we turn to another poll to find out how optimistic our listeners are about whether you believe poverty can be ended in your lifetime.
I wonder if the younger you are, the more optimistic you'll be.
It would be interesting if we could get that kind of information. So we're looking right now, people are voting. I guess half of everyone has voted now. I see more coming in. it looks like we have a 30-60 split, 40-60. 40% think yes, 60% think no, poverty cannot be eliminated in our lifetime.
I want to
Okay.
hear from people. Let's get those questions coming in. Let's have a discussion. Let's understand better why people think that they're not optimistic that it'll happen in our lifetime. And I want to hear from the optimists too. Like,
I think some of the questions so far, Paul and Adam, when you had, let me just close this, when you had talked about Ontario, I think that really struck a chord with people. People weren't as optimistic as you are in that area. So regarding, you know, like the basic income, social assistance, OW and ODSP, can you tell us a little bit more about your optimism after we've had this transition to a new government and some of their new policies?
yeah, I mean, you know, I think, and Adam, you can jump in here too. I mean, you know, we can be positive or we can be negative about things like that. And obviously, you know, the way the basic income pilot was ended is it's not right. You know, more time should have been given there. But time will tell. Like you know, the conservatives in Alberta were working on a poverty reduction strategy. You know, the poverty reduction strategy that we have in Ontario is an all-party strategy. So it's not that I've never spoken to a conservative, particularly a progressive conservative, that would say having a poverty reduction strategy is wrong. So I'm wanting to be hopeful until I'm proven wrong, and I'm going to work really hard in the next year to help this Ontario government, the new Ontario government, to understand why we need to do as much as possible, and it's good for all of Ontarians to have a strategy and to invest heavily in reducing poverty.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, I think I would share some of the concern amongst, you know, the folks who asked that question, because it does in part feel like, you know, there's an undoing, right, of some of that progress, and that was based on some really good work, I think. I'm thinking particularly around the once in a generation work to really look at transforming social assistance. And but I agree that time will tell, because you never know what impact the pressure and the momentum for poverty reduction at all, you know, across the country at different jurisdictions. You don't know what impact that'll have, and you don't know what impact will come from working with governments and helping them to understand, you know, the benefits of poverty reduction. But yeah, time will definitely tell on that front. Natasha, what other questions are coming in right now?
Well, kind of related to what we were just talking about, the government strategies. You know, how do we know that government strategies are going to translate into real practice and into impact on the ground? Do you have any responses to that question?
What are your thoughts, Adam?
Well, on that one, I always think it's important when strategies are very clear about their goals. So, you know, of course, governments can, you know, things change within government all the time, and governments change. But I think the anti-poverty movement in Canada has worked really hard. And I know in the Vibrant Communities Network, there's been a real focus on what those strategies should look like. And if a strategy is, you know, multi-year and sets out a clear target for reducing poverty, like we talked about with the federal plan, 50% reduction by 2030, and if it's accompanied with legislation, and if it focuses on a rights-based approach, those aren't guarantees of anything necessarily, but they all go a long way, I think, to helping to assure us that, you know, that's something we can work with. That's a good foundation. And then, of course, it's up to all of us to work to push governments all the time and to make sure that they are accountable, because we know even if public opinion recently might be turning and more favorable toward government action on poverty, I still think there's a huge challenge around the stigma of poverty and this distinction between deserving and undeserving poor that plays out in policies. So I think we just have to be really clear about what we expect from government strategies, and we have to help them get there.
Great, thanks. I have nothing to add, Natasha. That was a great answer.
Adam, I think our cities reducing poverty movement is absolutely feeding into that, you know, like local strategies on the ground. Somebody asked about Hamilton and St. John, which are two of our cities reducing poverty cities, and they're asking, do we have any, or do you have any specific examples about Hamilton and St. John or some of the other cities reducing poverty members are enabling population level results?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the population level change is always tricky. So I don't want to create the impression that we have a ton of examples out there right now where we can clearly attribute the work of communities within the city's reducing poverty network to population level change, because the reality of poverty and the just how interrelated all the factors are and how complex it is makes it difficult to draw those clear links. But I do think when we see communities like St. John come together around a clear community agenda for poverty reduction, in their case, ending intergenerational poverty, and bringing the right players together, having a plan that's very focused, and bringing together the right people to implement the plan, you can see results at a population level. It takes time. And of course, you know, I know, Paul, you've been working with hundreds of communities on collective impact. And of course, that's part of that whole process, is making sure that communities are setting out their common agenda and are setting it up to be able to measure the progress of the strategy. And I think we're seeing more and more communities doing that. Sometimes it's on in a specific area. I'm thinking of Calgary and the Financial Empowerment Collaborative, the work there, but tremendous results as far as improving income security for people. So I think there's, you know, with more and more examples, we're going to have more resources out there to point to and to draw upon in doing the work. But I think collective impact is a big part of it.
I agree with you, Adam, and it's a top priority in cities reducing poverty to get this data, to get the real information for people. And so we're going to just see in upcoming reports, we'll have much more to share.
And we actually had a comment from Mark closer to the beginning of the webinar, Paul. To your introduction, he commented that poverty programs miss the point. Poverty is systemic in our economic model, and they help a few, but poverty is calculated for. So not as optimistic as you. Do you have a response to that?
Several years ago, the head of the Canadian Medical Association, the elected official, I believe he was an emergency doctor from Edmonton, spent the entire year traveling the country and giving a presentation on that if we are to save Medicare, we need to end poverty. And, you know, I know in Hamilton, you know, there was an amazing story written by the Hamilton Spectator called Code Red that looked at the health differences and longevity, life, like how long people live, differences between a low-income neighborhoods and the upper income neighborhoods. I think on that one alone, a belief that poverty is written in, that it's accounted for, that we need it essentially to make things work. I think that's an old way of thinking. I think we've come to the conclusion. I'm hoping that we've come to the conclusion. I've come to the conclusion that we can't afford poverty as a society. And that with poverty, it will affect all of our quality of life. So it's in the benefit of all of us to end it.
And Paul, we actually did have a comment. There are some optimistic people in the crowd as well, from Liz, who says that she's in Northern Ontario and are optimistic that they were able to align their program proposal with the provincial strategy and get 100% funded.
Fantastic.
So we have another question from John, and John is asking, we need to have strong leadership in all levels of society. What can be done to develop system and collaborative leaders to drive change? Pretty big question.
That's a great question. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Why don't you start, Adam? I certainly have some thoughts.
Sure. Well, I'm just off the top, I'm thinking, going back to the State of Cities Reducing Poverty paper and that work, that was one of the things that was really exciting to me, is looking at how this multi-sector model within vibrant communities really does lay the foundation. It creates conditions for people across all sectors to find a voice, become champions. I'm thinking people with lived experience and living experience, people from the business community, government, people from the not-for-profit sector, everyone coming together, and just by virtue of coming together across those different perspectives, able to find new solutions, come at the problem maybe in a different way, and also build capacity and build resilience within the community. So I think there's a lot in that model that that can help to that question. I've certainly seen it firsthand, in the work that I did with Pathway to Potential in Windsor, and I was only able to really do that by learning from all the other communities that were doing that type of work.
That is the work that Tamarack does, the Tamarack Institute, but we're not the only ones. We run great training programs for people in collaborative leadership. There's all kinds of good programs out there in this area. I think the value of us learning and thinking together, by making it a priority, it becomes more of a priority for leaders. And I think that's the key. I think the key, though, is that we got to figure out what our shared measurement is. So it's about learning how to develop a common agenda, but also to have a shared measurement, because I've heard this word, this statement, we treasure what we measure. And I agree with that. It's like we're not going to get the leadership on this unless we are able to see results at a population level, and that we have a good measure. And I'm just, I know that it seemed like a small thing to people, but Minister Duclos has spent his life thinking about measures around poverty reduction. He's an academic that has spoken globally on this issue many times. And so he was obsessed by getting this, maybe that's not the right word, but it felt that way, about getting this right, and getting a good measure for poverty reduction, and standing up to that. It may not seem historical, but it actually is. It's the first time in Canadian history that we have an official poverty line, and a lot of commitment to setting targets and rising toward them. And that's really what leadership is.
How about leadership in the private sector? So Elliot's asking, what can the private sector do in poverty reduction, and how could the government work better to support the private sector to participate in poverty reduction initiatives?
Yeah, we're seeing that in many cities across the country. I mean, both in terms of employers wanting to pay a living wage and joining the living wage movement. So that's the obvious one. Many employers seeing their work as creating good jobs for people, and creating employment and income for people. There's a triple bottom line. Return on investment is no longer just about making money. It is about creating a better society. It is about creating a better world. And it's a marvelous vehicle to do that in. We have been recruiting and working with business leaders across the country, and they have an awful lot to share.
Yeah, just having the voices of leaders from the business community is very powerful. Having creating conditions to build champions, to draw on the influence of those leaders. And there are so many different ways that business communities can get involved if they're asked. And I'm not sure about the answer to off the top of my head around what governments could do. But certainly I know even with this latest federal strategy, there is more and more effort, I think, on the part of governments to really try to understand poverty from the perspective of all the different sectors, whether it's people with lived experience, whether it's a business community. And so I think just providing that space and truly listening to people is a good start.
And if I could just end with one of the comments in the comments box on the theme of optimism, Lisa Patterson wrote in, "I am an optimist. If you don't believe you can do something, you never will."
Well, thanks, Lisa, and thanks to everybody. This has been it went by too fast. We could have continued this, I'm sure, for another hour, but looking at the time, we do have to end our discussion, and I do have a few closing announcements to make, but I do want to thank all of you who attended the webinar today for all of your thoughtful questions, your contributions, your responses to the polls. So please stay in touch with Tamarack Institute and Vibrant Communities Canada. You can receive the latest thinking, news, tools, and resources from our network by signing up to receive Cities Reducing Poverty's bi-monthly newsletter, or by visiting our online learning community at tamarackcommunity.ca/Cities Reducing Poverty. You can also learn with us in person. Join us, as Paul mentioned, in Mississauga to explore innovative ways that local communities are leading the way in poverty reduction. Our Eastern Regional Summit, Cities Innovating to Reduce Poverty, will welcome communities from Ontario, Quebec, Nunavut, Newfoundland's East Coast, all gathering September 18th and 19th. So please use the registration link at the bottom of the screen, or CRP, Cities Reducing Poverty members can contact Natasha at tamarackcommunity.ca to reserve your 2 free seats. Also taking place in September is a one-day intensive workshop in Sarnia, Ontario on collective impact, hosted by Paul Bourne. This workshop will provide you with simple, practical tools and approaches for deepening community. Participants will learn how to engage and deepen community in order to build a common agenda for large-scale change. Find the registration link at the bottom of your screen. Register now for the Community Change Festival. Over 4 days, participants will explore the 5 competencies every change maker needs to move from ideas to practice to impact: collective impact, community engagement, community innovation, collaborative leadership, and evaluating impact. We will host workshops, open space dialogue, present tools, take you on immersive tours, facilitate peer input processes, and more. Find the registration link again at the bottom of your screen. And in a few days, you will receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, as well as the learning opportunities just mentioned. You can email Natasha at tamarackcommunity.ca to provide feedback about today's webinar. We are always trying to improve on the experience. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.